Subscribe our channel for more videos.
They spent 4 years building the most expensive fortress in human history. 17 million cubic meters of concrete, 1.2 million tons of steel, 300,000 enslaved human beings working 12-hour shifts in all weather until their bodies gave out. Adolf Hitler stood before his generals and declared himself, without a trace of irony, the greatest builder of fortifications of all time. The man tasked with defending it called it something else, a gigantic bluff. And on the morning of June 6, 1944, 150,000 Allied soldiers were about to prove him right. But here is what the history books skip over. The Atlantic Wall did not fail because the Allies were stronger. It failed because of 3 catastrophic mistakes made by the Germans themselves. Mistakes so stunning, so avoidable, so deeply human in their arrogance and paranoia that they essentially handed the Allies the keys to Fortress Europe before a single boot touched the sand. One man slept through the invasion. One ghost army that never existed fooled an entire intelligence apparatus, and 2 of Germany's greatest military minds argued so bitterly about strategy that they split their most powerful weapon in half and rendered it useless. This is not just the story of D-Day. This is the story of how Nazi Germany destroyed itself from the inside out on the most consequential day of the 20th century. To understand how the wall fell, you first have to understand why it was built. And the answer is not strength. It is desperation dressed up as confidence. Cast your mind back to the summer of 1940. Germany has just pulled off one of the most stunning military victories in the history of organized warfare. France, a nation of 40 million people protected by the legendary Maginot Line, has fallen in 6 weeks. The Wehrmacht is drunk on momentum. Hitler stands at the peak of his power, surveying a continent that has bent to his will. From the English Channel to the borders of the Soviet Union, the swastika flies over capital after capital. And yet, even in that moment of triumph, a cold reality is already beginning to crystallize at the edge of Hitler's awareness. He cannot fight everywhere forever. No nation can, not even Germany. The first coastal fortifications were modest, gun batteries around submarine bases, watchtowers along the Channel Cliffs, basic structures designed to deter British commando raids and protect the U-boat pens that were slowly strangling Allied shipping lanes. Nobody was calling it the Atlantic Wall yet. It was barely a fence. But then Operation Barbarossa happened, and everything changed. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched the largest military invasion in human history against the Soviet Union. 3 million German soldiers crossed the border on a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles. The plan was to crush the Red Army in 8 to 10 weeks before winter arrived. What actually happened was something else entirely. The Soviets absorbed the blows, retreated, regrouped, and began fighting back with a ferocity that shocked the German high command. By December, with German soldiers freezing to death in the snow outside Moscow, the Lightning War had become a grinding, bleeding, merciless war of attrition. And across the Atlantic, something even more alarming was happening. The United States had entered the war. Suddenly, Hitler was staring down a 2-front nightmare. In the East, the Red Army was becoming stronger by the month, fed by American industrial production pouring across the Pacific and Atlantic. In the West, it was only a matter of time before the Americans and British attempted to retake continental Europe. Germany needed a solution. What Hitler chose was concrete. On March 23, 1942, he issued Führer Directive No. 40. It was one of the most ambitious military construction orders ever written. The entire western coastline of Europe, from the Arctic tip of Norway all the way south to the Pyrenees Mountains on the Spanish border, approximately 2,000 miles of coastline, was to be transformed into a continuous, impenetrable defensive barrier. 15,000 individual defensive positions, bunkers, gun batteries, observation posts, minefields, tank traps, and anti-aircraft installations woven together into a single unbroken wall of steel and concrete. The project would be called the Atlantic Wall, and it would consume resources on a scale that staggers the imagination even 80 years later. The organization tasked with building this monster was called Organization Tott, a civil-military engineering group originally created to build Germany's famous Autobahn highway system and the Siegfried Line along the French border. After its founder, Fritz Tott, died in a mysterious plane explosion in February of 1942, the organization passed to Hitler's personal architect, Albert Speer, though the day-to-day command was handled by his deputy, Franz Shaver-Dorsch, a man who understood concrete the way a surgeon understands flesh. Dorsch was brilliant, ruthless, and utterly committed to the task. He needed to be, because what Hitler was asking for had never been attempted in human history. At its peak, Organization Tott mobilized approximately 300,000 laborers simultaneously. And here is where the story becomes something darker than military history, because virtually none of those workers were volunteers. The men who built Hitler's great fortress were the war's invisible victims. French civilians conscripted under the Service de Travail Obligatoire, a forced labor program that tore men from their families and shipped them to coastal construction sites. Soviet prisoners of war who had already survived death marches from the Eastern Front, men so broken by captivity that building bunkers in the rain felt like a mercy compared to what they had left behind. Polish forced laborers, North African workers, Indo-Chinese men brought from the other side of the world, Belgian Jews, and one of history's most heartbreaking ironies, roughly 40,000 Spanish Republican exiles, men who had fled Francisco Franco's fascist Spain to escape persecution, only to end up on the coast of occupied France, pouring concrete for another fascist regime. Only about 10% of the entire workforce was German. The conditions were medieval. Workers lived in barracks converted from old factories and warehouses, sleeping on wooden bunks with minimal bedding. Rations were calculated with cold precision to provide exactly enough calories to keep a human body working, nothing more, nothing extra. 12-hour shifts in rain, wind, and freezing cold. Concrete, once begun, could not stop being poured, or it would set improperly, so the work ran day and night, shift after shift, in a grinding rhythm that broke men over weeks and months. Accidents were constant. Medical care was nearly non-existent. A man who collapsed from exhaustion or illness was, in the brutal accounting of the program, simply replaced. The exact number who died building the Atlantic Wall will never be known with certainty. Historians estimate it in the tens of thousands. Their names are mostly lost. Their sacrifice is commemorated in academic papers and plaques that tourists rarely stop to read. And then came the event that transformed a construction project into an obsession. On August 19, 1942, approximately 6,000 Canadian and British commandos launched a frontal assault on the fortified port of Dieppe on the French coast. The raid was a catastrophe of stunning proportions. Nearly 60% of the attacking force became casualties. Over 900 men were killed. Landing craft were raked with fire before they could even reach the beach. Tanks became bogged in the shingle and were destroyed one by one. The survivors who made it off the beach were the lucky ones. As military operations go, Dieppe was one of the most complete disasters the Allies suffered during the entire war.
But for Hitler, it was a gift, because Dieppe proved, at least in his mind, that a fortified coastline could stop an invasion cold. He ordered 15,000 defensive positions completed by May of 1943. Organization Tott engineers, doing the math against available resources, told him that 40% was realistically achievable. Concrete pouring surged from roughly 50,000 cubic meters per month in March of 1942 to 780,000 cubic meters by April of 1943, a 15-fold increase in 13 months. On paper, it looked like a miracle of industrial will. In reality, it was the beginning of an enormous strategic illusion. By the end of 1943, only 8,000 of the planned 15,000 structures had been completed, 53% of the target, and those structures were not distributed evenly along the coastline. They clustered heavily around two priorities that would prove disastrous: the Pas-de-Calais region, where the English Channel was at its narrowest, just 21 miles across, where a rational military planner would expect the shortest and most logical invasion route, and the major port cities, because German strategic doctrine was built on the assumption that any large-scale invasion force would need to capture a functional port within days or face logistical collapse. Normandy, 500 miles to the southwest, remained a secondary concern, a quiet sector, almost an afterthought, and that is where the Allies were coming. Then arrived the man who would do more in 5 months than had been accomplished in 3.5 years, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the man who had made the British sweat and bleed across the sands of North Africa before being driven back by superior numbers and, crucially, by Allied air power. In November of 1943, Hitler appointed Rommel as Inspector of Coastal Defenses, tasked with a comprehensive review of the Atlantic Wall's readiness. What Rommel found when he completed his 2-week inspection tour was enough to make a soldier's blood run cold. The fortifications he found were incomplete, poorly positioned, and in entire sectors barely existent. Bunkers had been built without regard for fields of fire, positioned so that they could not actually cover the beaches they were supposed to protect. Artillery batteries sat without adequate ammunition stores. Minefields existed on paper, carefully marked on maps in German headquarters, but had never actually been laid in the ground. Beach obstacles that should have been installed years earlier remained sitting in warehouses or had never even been manufactured. In some places, soldiers assigned to defend the beaches had no clear defensive plan whatsoever. Rommel wrote home to his wife Lucy and described the Atlantic Wall as a figment of Hitler's cloud cuckoo land, in German Wolkenkuckucksheim, a fantasy architecture built on paper and propaganda, disconnected from the brutal physics of modern warfare. He looked at what was supposed to stop the most powerful military alliance in history and saw a bluff, a very expensive, very photogenic bluff. He threw himself at the problem with the volcanic energy that had made him famous. In just 5 months, from January to May of 1944, Rommel drove the construction of 4,600 additional hardened fortifications. He laid 6 million landmines along the beaches and coastal approaches. He erected 517,000 foreshore obstacles, those angular steel and concrete structures designed to rip open the bottoms of landing craft, with 31,000 of them fitted with teller mines that would detonate on contact. He planted over 1 million wooden poles in the fields behind the beaches, obstacles designed to destroy Allied gliders attempting to land airborne troops in the dark. The soldiers who installed them, with grim German soldier humor, called them Rommel's asparagus. One academic study concluded that what Rommel achieved in 5 months exceeded everything that had been built in the preceding 3.5 years combined. It was extraordinary, and it was not enough, not even close. Rommel had wanted 50 million mines laid. He received 6 million, roughly 12% of his request. Construction in the Normandy sector remained only 18% complete in critical areas when the calendar turned to June of 1944. 3 of the 6 planned rows of beach obstacles were never installed. The resources simply did not exist to do everything the wall required. And looming above all of this physical inadequacy was something worse, a disagreement so fundamental, so bitterly personal, that it would paralyze Germany's response at the exact moment when paralysis was fatal. The soldiers assigned to defend the wall were not Germany's best,
By 1944, the finest divisions of the Wehrmacht were hemorrhaging into the frozen earth of the Eastern Front, fighting a war of attrition against an enemy who could absorb losses that would have destroyed any other nation. The divisions assigned to France were a collection of recovering units, training formations, and garrison troops deemed unsuitable to the hell of Russia. Many were classified as static divisions, meaning they lacked the vehicles and transport necessary to relocate. They were expected to fight from their positions and, if necessary, die in them. Some were even more extraordinary. The Ostlegionen, the Eastern Legions, were formations built around former Soviet prisoners of war who had been offered a stark choice by their German captors: pick up a German rifle or starve in a prisoner of war camp. Georgians, Azerbaijanis, Ukrainians, Turkestanis, men who often spoke no German, men who had no ideological investment in National Socialism, men whose combat reliability in a desperate defensive battle was, to put it diplomatically, uncertain. At Utah Beach, elements of the 709th Static Infantry Division included the 795th Georgian Battalion, former Soviet soldiers who on the morning of June 6th would find themselves facing the American 4th Infantry Division. Their German officers, many of them veterans of earlier campaigns who had been wounded or were considered too old for the Eastern Front, did their best with what they had. They ran drills, they maintained discipline, they tried to instill fighting spirit in men who had every reason to question what they were fighting for. But they harbored few illusions. They had seen the reconnaissance reports. They knew what was coming across the channel. They just didn't know when or where. Now we reach the first of the 3 fatal mistakes that doomed the Atlantic Wall. And to understand it properly, you need to understand the command structure that governed Germany's defense of Western Europe, because it was not so much a command structure as it was a bureaucratic nightmare held together with paperwork and personal loyalty to a single man. No fewer than 7 overlapping chains of authority governed Western defense: Armed Forces High Command under Keitel and Jodl, OB West under von Rundstedt, Army Group B under Rommel, Army Group G under Blaskowitz, Panzer Group West under Gehr von Schweppenberg, Luftflotte 3 under Sperle, and Navy Group West under Kranke. The Luftflotte and Navy operated almost entirely independently. Von Rundstedt could issue directives, suggestions, requests. He could not give them direct orders. Organization Tat made its own decisions about what to build and where, without consulting the military units that would actually fight from those structures. And over all of this, like a spider at the center of an impossible web, sat Adolf Hitler, who had retained personal control of the Panzer Reserve divisions. No armored division could move without his explicit, personal approval.
This was not military doctrine. This was megalomania wearing the costume of military doctrine. The greatest defensive moment in the entire Western War, the moment of Allied vulnerability when troops were still in the water and on the beaches and hadn't yet established themselves on French soil, would require instant decisions and immediate movement. And the Germans had built a system that made instant decisions constitutionally impossible. June 5, 1944, the day before the world changed. Along the coast of Normandy, German soldiers went about their routines with something that felt almost like boredom. The weather was miserable. Rain squalls swept across the beaches. The English Channel was rough and gray and dangerous. No invasion fleet could possibly cross in conditions like this. The German Meteorological Service, which had lost access to weather stations in the Atlantic when they lost control of the seas, had predicted 2 more weeks of storms at minimum. The Allies weren't coming. Not yet. Everyone could relax. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was not at his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon. He was 800 kilometers away in Herrlingen, Germany. He had gone home for his wife Lucy's 50th birthday. He carried a gift he had bought for her in Paris, a pair of gray suede shoes. He was also planning a separate trip to meet with Hitler, to once again argue,
beg and demand additional panzer divisions be moved closer to the beaches. He would not get the meeting, and before he could return to France, the longest day of his life would have already been decided without him. General Friedrich Dahlmann, commanding the 7th Army responsible for Normandy, had scheduled a war game exercise for the morning of June 6th, a map exercise. Ironically, almost poetically, the exercise was designed to simulate an Allied landing in Normandy, to prepare his commanders for that exact scenario. Approximately 50% of his division commanders and 25% of his regimental commanders had traveled to Rennes for this conference. They would not be with their men when the real thing began. General Wilhelm Folly of the 91st Air Landing Division left his headquarters that evening for Rennes. On the way back, in the pre-dawn darkness of June 6th, his staff car was ambushed by American paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division, who were themselves lost and confused in the Norman darkness. Folly was killed on the roadside, miles from his command post, on the most critical morning of the war. He became the first German general to die in the Normandy campaign. Shortly after 12:30 in the morning, Pathfinder paratroopers from the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions began dropping into the darkness over the Cotentin Peninsula. They came through clouds and anti-aircraft fire, scattered by navigation errors and enemy flak, landing in farmyards, flooded fields, on rooftops, in trees. Some drowned in marshes that Rommel had deliberately flooded. Others landed in the middle of German positions and fought hand-to-hand in the dark. British paratroopers of the 6th Airborne Division landed east of the Orne River and seized Pegasus Bridge in one of the most perfectly executed small-unit operations of the entire war. The German sentries who first saw parachutes reported them, then more parachutes, then gliders. The reports were confused and contradictory. Some officers dismissed them as supply drops for the French resistance or small commando raids designed to cause confusion. Others recognized the scale of what was happening, but could not reconcile it with what their meteorologists had told them was possible. An invasion in weather like this? Impossible. At Field Marshal von Rundstedt's headquarters at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, near Paris, staff officers received the first reports with official skepticism. An airborne operation of this scale was unprecedented. It could be a feint, a diversion designed to pull German reserves out of position before the real invasion came somewhere else, probably Pas-de-Calais, almost certainly Pas-de-Calais. That was where the ghost was pointed, and we will get to the ghost in a moment. But von Rundstedt was not fooled. The old field marshal, the most experienced soldier in the German army, looked at the reports coming in from across the Norman coast and recognized the truth immediately. This was not a diversion, this was the invasion, and it was coming at Normandy. He made his decision quickly, with the confidence of a man who had spent his entire military career learning to read a battle. He ordered the 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division to move immediately toward the beachhead, stop the invasion before it could get established, hit the Allies while they were still wet and confused and vulnerable. But von Rundstedt did not have the authority to give that order. Those divisions were part of Hitler's personal reserve. No movement without Hitler's authorization, no exceptions. His order was intercepted by staff officers at Armed Forces High Command, who recognized immediately that releasing those divisions required the Führer's authorization. General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations, received the request at approximately 6 in the morning. He refused to wake Hitler. The Führer had taken sleeping pills the previous evening and had given standing orders not to be disturbed, and nobody in that headquarters had the courage, or perhaps the survival instinct, to violate those orders. Adolf Hitler slept until approximately 10 in the morning. 10 in the morning, while the greatest amphibious invasion in history was writing itself in blood on the beaches of France. When he was finally informed, he did not immediately release the panzer divisions. He attended a scheduled reception for the Hungarian Prime Minister in Salzburg. He discussed the strategic situation with his advisors with an almost eerie calm. He delayed. The armored reserves were finally released sometime between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, 12 hours, an eternity in modern warfare, an eternity that could not be recovered. The 21st Panzer Division illustrated the paralysis in the sharpest possible terms. It was the only armored unit positioned within striking distance of the beach landings, stationed approximately 20 miles from the coast near Caen. Its commander, General Edgar Feuchtinger, was absent from his post when the invasion began, reportedly in Paris with a female companion. The division sat, engines cold, waiting for clearance from Hitler's headquarters to move. General Erich Marx, the corps commander, did not receive authority over the 21st until noon, 6 hours after the landings had begun. The division then had to fight its way through the bottleneck at Caen, crossing damaged bridges under naval bombardment, in traffic choked by retreating vehicles and panicked refugees. A 10-mile move consumed 3 hours. The counterattack finally launched at 4 in the afternoon, and for one brief, flickering moment, it almost worked. The 1st Battalion of the 192nd Panzer Grenadier Regiment actually reached the sea at Lyon-sur-Mer, momentarily splitting the British beachhead between Sword and Juno beaches. It was the only German unit to reach the water on D-Day. The battalion stood on the beach, looking at the channel, understanding in that moment both the magnitude of what they had achieved and the impossibility of their situation. They were alone. No support on either flank. Naval gunfire was already zeroing in. And then, at 9 in the evening, 246 British gliders appeared in the darkening sky overhead, bringing reinforcements to the 6th Airborne Division. They looked up at that vast, silent armada and withdrew. The opportunity was gone. The 21st Panzer Division reported as few as 54 operational tanks by nightfall.
Major Hans von Luck, one of the division's most capable officers, captured the agony of that day in a single sentence. The clearance for an immediate night attack, so as to take advantage of the initial confusion among our opponents, had still not come. By the time it came, the confusion was over. The beachhead was real. The 12th SS Hitler Youth Division did not begin moving from Lisieux until 5 in the afternoon. It arrived piecemeal on June 7th, too late to affect D-Day's outcome. Panzer Lehr, one of the most powerful armored formations in the German military, did not reach the front until June 9th. During the approach march, Allied aircraft caught the division on open roads in broad daylight. It lost approximately 90 armored vehicles and 130 trucks before firing a single shot at the enemy. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, ordered from Montauban in southern France on June 7th, began its march north the following day. French resistance fighters sabotaged roads, bridges, and railways. Allied aircraft hunted every vehicle that moved during daylight. The division committed the massacre at Oradour-sur-Glane on June 10th, murdering 642 French civilians, including 247 children, a war crime born partly of the frustration and rage of an elite unit reduced to helplessness by partisans and Allied air power. Das Reich's advanced elements did not reach Normandy until mid-June. The full division was not assembled until late in the month. The window was closed. The first fatal mistake had done its work. Now for the second mistake, and this one involves a ghost. To understand Operation Fortitude, you first have to understand the German intelligence apparatus in Britain, or rather, you have to understand the catastrophic truth about that apparatus, which is that it did not exist, not in any meaningful sense. Every single German agent who had been inserted into Britain had been captured by British intelligence. Every one. The British Security Service, MI5, had achieved something genuinely extraordinary: total,
comprehensive control over every piece of intelligence information reaching Berlin from their island. Every report that arrived claiming to describe Allied troop movements, supply concentrations, and invasion preparations was either fabricated entirely by British intelligence officers or carefully edited to serve Allied strategic purposes. And one man turned this achievement into a weapon of almost supernatural power. Juan Pujol Garcia was a Spanish anti-fascist who hated Nazism with such intensity that he walked into the British embassy in Madrid and volunteered to spy against Germany and was turned down. So he walked into the German intelligence service and volunteered to spy against Britain. They accepted. They gave him the code name Arabelle. He told them he was traveling to Britain to build an intelligence network. He never went to Britain. He ran his entire operation from Lisbon, fabricating agent reports from British travel guides, library books, and his own extraordinary imagination. He invented 27 fictitious sub-agents spread across Britain, each with their own carefully constructed biographical detail and regional specialty. He sent over 500 radio messages between January and June of 1944 to his German handlers, who regarded him as their most reliable and valuable agent in Britain. They eventually discovered what he was doing, recruited him properly, gave him the code name Garbo, and put the full resources of British intelligence behind his operation. He was, his MI5 handler said with genuine admiration, a natural. The Germans paid him $340,000 to maintain his fictional network. He received both the German Iron Cross, authorized personally by Adolf Hitler, and the British MBE. He remains the only person in history to be decorated by both sides of the same war. The physical apparatus of Operation Fortitude was elaborate enough to be convincing even from the air. 255 dummy landing craft, built from steel tubes and canvas, floated in Folkestone Harbor. Inflatable rubber Sherman tanks were repositioned nightly to simulate unit movements. Fake army camps with empty tents were constructed by set builders from Shepperton Studios, who brought their movie-making craft to the Great Deception. Plywood aircraft sat on dummy airfields across Kent and Essex. The 1st United States Army Group, a formation of 11 non-existent divisions comprising approximately 150,000 imaginary soldiers, generated enough radio traffic to convince German signals intelligence that an enormous army was massing in southeast England, aimed like a knife at Pas-de-Calais, the logical jumping-off point for the shortest crossing to France. This phantom army was notionally commanded by General George S. Patton, which was a stroke of genius, because Patton was exactly the commander Germany would expect to lead the most important Allied operation. He was aggressive, brilliant, and famous. Of course, Patton would command the real invasion. Therefore, wherever Patton was, that was where the real invasion was coming. And German intelligence was watching Patton, who was standing in front of Wentworth near Ascot, reviewing the Ghost Army. The Allies even adjusted their bombing campaign to maintain the fiction. For every ton of bombs dropped on targets in Normandy before D-Day, 2 tons fell on the Pas-de-Calais area. Every piece of German aerial reconnaissance that managed to photograph the buildup in southeast England, and the last successful German aerial photographs were taken on May 25th, nearly 2 weeks before D-Day, showed concentrations of vehicles, equipment, and personnel aimed at Calais. They could not know the tanks were rubber and the camps were empty. Colonel Elix von Rona, head of German intelligence for the Western Front, and here history offers another of its extraordinary ironies, a secret anti-Nazi monarchist who is actively working to mislead Hitler's high command, deliberately inflated the 44 real Allied divisions identified in Britain to 89 in his official reports. He gave the Phantom Army enormous credibility. He would later be implicated in the July 20th assassination plot against Hitler and executed. He died having served in his own way as one of the most effective Allied agents of the war. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, German military intelligence, had by 1944 become a determined opponent of the Nazi regime. He systematically undermined German intelligence operations, protected anti-Nazi elements within his organization, and failed deliberately to identify the penetration of his spy networks. He too would be implicated in the July 20th plot and executed in April of 1945, just weeks before Germany surrendered. The highest levels of German intelligence had been rotted from within. Then came D-Day, and Garbo delivered his masterpiece. In the early hours of June 6th, he transmitted a warning to his German handlers that an invasion was beginning. The message arrived too late to matter militarily, which was deliberate, but it established his credibility for what came next. On June 9th, 3 days after the Normandy landings, with German commanders desperately trying to funnel reinforcements to the beachhead, Garbo transmitted the most consequential lie in the history of military deception. The present attack on Normandy is a large-scale operation, but diversionary in character, he reported. The constant aerial bombardment which the area of Pas-de-Calais has suffered gives reason to suspect an attack in that region. Colonel Adolf Friedrich Krummacher, the German intelligence officer who received the message, annotated it in red ink. The report confirms the view already held by us that a further attack is to be expected in another place. The message reached Hitler within hours.
At 7:30 in the morning on June 10th, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel telephoned von Rundstedt with Hitler's order. The movement of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler toward Normandy was cancelled. Tanks already on the road were turned around, sent back to Pas-de-Calais to wait for an invasion that would never come. Hitler kept 2 armored divisions and 19 infantry divisions at Pas-de-Calais through July and August of 1944. Nearly 150,000 of Germany's best soldiers sitting in the wrong place for 7 weeks, waiting for a ghost army commanded by a general reviewing rubber tanks and empty tents. Polish double agent Roman Czerniawski, codenamed Brutus, reinforced the deception by reporting that the Phantom Army Group remained intact and poised. German headquarters spent the critical weeks after D-Day not throwing everything at Normandy, but hedging, waiting, watching Pas-de-Calais. The second fatal mistake had done its work. Now the third, the bitterest of all, because it was a disagreement between 2 soldiers who were both, in their own way, right. By the spring of 1944, the fundamental question facing the German defense was not whether the Allies would invade. That was coming, and everyone knew it. The question was what to do about the Panzer divisions, the armored mobile reserve that was Germany's most powerful card. And on this question, 2 of the most experienced military minds in the Wehrmacht had reached diametrically opposite conclusions. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt advocated the doctrine of mobile defense. Let the Allies land, he argued. Allow them to establish a beachhead, to commit their forces, to reveal the invasion's true focal point. Then concentrate the panzer reserves for a massive armored counterstroke, striking from inland, beyond the reach of Allied naval guns, crushing the beachhead before it could grow. It was classic armored warfare doctrine, the same approach that had delivered Germany's stunning victory over France in 1940. General Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg, commanding Panzer Group West, supported this view completely. Give us the tanks inland, let the battle develop, then hit them with concentrated armor and destroy them. Rommel had learned a different lesson. He had learned it in the desert, in blood and dust and defeat. He had watched what even a numerically inferior Allied air force could do to armored formations caught moving in the open.
He had been pinned to the ground with 80,000 men for 2 to 3 days at a stretch by constant air attack in the western desert, in conditions far less favorable to Allied aircraft than the skies over Normandy would be. He knew, with the bone-deep certainty of painful experience, that no panzer division moving through France during daylight in the summer of 1944 would reach the battlefield intact. Allied air supremacy would see to that. His strategy was brutal in its simplicity. The panzers had to be at the beaches before the invasion happened, positioned close enough to counterattack within hours. Destroy the enemy at the waterline, not tomorrow, not after the battle develops, now, in those first desperate hours when the Allies are most vulnerable. If we cannot get at the enemy immediately after he lands, Rommel warned, with the quiet certainty of a man who has watched his predictions come true too many times, we will never be able to make another move. The first 24 hours will be decisive. If we fail to repulse the enemy at sea or throw him off the mainland in that first day, then the invasion will have succeeded and the war will be lost. Both men were right within the limits of their own experience and reasoning, but they could not be right at the same time. And Hitler, who could not bear to be wrong, imposed a compromise on March 21, 1944, that made both of them wrong simultaneously. 3 panzer divisions went to Rommel's Army Group B, but 2 of them were deployed in the Pas-de-Calais sector, leaving only the 21st Panzer Division near Caen to cover all of Normandy. 3 divisions went to Army Group G in southern France, too far away to influence any battle in the north. 4 of the most critical divisions, including the 12th SS, Panzer Lehr, and the 1st SS, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, were placed under Hitler's personal reserve. Nobody moved without Hitler's approval. The result was a force too dispersed to serve either doctrine, positioned neither close enough to the beaches to destroy the landings in the first hours, nor concentrated enough inland to deliver a decisive counterstroke later. In trying to make a limited resource stretch to satisfy 2 strategic visions, Hitler had destroyed the effectiveness of both. Rommel had specifically requested that the 12th SS Panzer Division be moved from Évreux to Isigny, which would have placed it less than 10 miles from Omaha Beach instead of 110 miles away to the east. Von Rundstedt, Geyer von Schweppenberg, and Guderian all refused. The tanks stayed in the wrong place. History proved Rommel right in the most devastating possible way. The division arrived too late, weakened by air attack, and could only contain rather than crush the Allied beachhead. Now let us stand on the beaches themselves, because that is where the human cost of these 3 fatal mistakes was paid in full. At Utah Beach, strong currents pushed the American landing craft approximately 2,000 yards south of their designated landing zone. This navigational accident proved fortunate. The sector where they actually landed was less heavily defended than their intended target. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., 56 years old, the son of a president, the only general to land with the first wave, walked the beach under fire with a walking stick, assessed the situation with remarkable calm, and made a decision that became legend. We will start the war from here. The defenders, including the Georgian Battalion and their German officers, faced the overwhelming firepower of the American 4th Infantry Division, backed by naval guns that could reach miles inland. Resistance crumbled quickly. American casualties at Utah Beach numbered just 297 among 21,000 troops landed. All 3 beach exits were secured within 3 hours. The Atlantic Wall had failed utterly in this sector. Omaha Beach was a different kind of history. The 352nd Infantry Division defended this sector. 12,000 men, including 6,800 veterans of the Eastern Front, tough, experienced soldiers who had survived the worst fighting of the entire war and were now positioned in terrain that amounted to a natural killing ground. Field Marshal Rommel personally ordered this division moved into position on March 15th, a fact that Allied intelligence had completely missed. 15 interconnected resistance nests created overlapping fields of fire across a crescent of sand, backed by 30-meter bluffs with only 5 narrow ravine exits. Any attacker would have to cross hundreds of meters of open beach under fire before reaching even minimal cover. It was, by any objective analysis, one of the strongest defensive positions on the entire Atlantic Wall.
And then everything that could go wrong for the Americans went wrong simultaneously. Low cloud caused the pre-assault bombing to miss the beach entirely. 2,000 tons of bombs fell harmlessly in the fields behind the German positions. 27 of 32 amphibious tanks in one battalion sank before reaching shore, their flotation screens overwhelmed by rough seas that nobody had anticipated being that heavy. The specialized armor that was supposed to suppress the German defenses lay at the bottom of the English Channel. The soldiers who had depended on those tanks to survive the crossing stepped off their landing craft ramps into hell with no armored support whatsoever. Landing craft ramps dropped, and men fell before they could take a single step forward. The water was red in the surf, bodies rolled in the waves. The wounded who couldn't move drowned when the tide came in over them. Surviving soldiers crawled behind the concrete seawall and the beach obstacles, unable to advance, unable to retreat, watching the men around them die in seconds. General Omar Bradley, watching from the cruiser USS Augusta offshore, briefly and seriously considered evacuating the beach entirely, abandoning it, accepting the catastrophic strategic and psychological consequences of that choice. For several desperate hours, it seemed the Atlantic Wall might actually hold in one sector. It seemed like Rommel had been right about what concrete and steel and well-positioned veterans could do. The Americans suffered approximately 2,400 casualties at Omaha Beach, somewhere around 770 killed. In terms of men lost per meter of sand, it was among the most costly assaults in American military history. But even at Omaha, the Atlantic Wall failed. The 352nd Division's defensive success was built on a foundation with a crack running through it. They had no reserves. General Dietrich Kreis had positioned his men brilliantly, had created the killing ground that worked exactly as designed, but he had nothing left to commit once the battle reached its full intensity. When he sent troops to his right to prevent the British from flanking Omaha at Gold Beach, he left gaps in his line. The German defenders ran low on ammunition as the morning wore on. Machine gun barrels overheated. Communications between strongpoints broke down as naval gunfire cut the telephone lines. And in those gaps, in those moments of silence between the bursts of fire, small groups of American soldiers began to move. Led by officers and sergeants who had survived the first waves and refused to stay still and die, they infiltrated between the strongpoints and scaled the bluffs from angles the Germans couldn't cover. By evening, a precarious but real foothold existed at Omaha Beach. The line had been breached. And unlike the Atlantic Wall, the human will that had breached it could not be patched with concrete. At Gold Beach, British forces landed at 7:25 in the morning. Cruisers HMS Ajax and HMS Argonaut neutralized 3 of 4 gun emplacements at Long-sur-Mer with naval gunfire before they could be fully effective. 25,000 British troops pushed 6 miles inland. At Juno Beach, Canadian forces faced withering initial fire and paid a brutal price, with nearly half their casualties occurring in the first hour. Despite this, they achieved the deepest Allied penetration of D-Day, reaching nearly to Carpiquet Airfield. At Sword Beach, 33 of 40 amphibious tanks made shore successfully, providing the armored support that swept aside the under-strength 716th Division. The Luftwaffe's contribution to defending the wall was essentially ceremonial. Against 14,674 Allied sorties on June 6th, Germany managed approximately 320.
The most famous German air response consisted of a single strafing run along the beaches by two Focke-Wulf 190s flown by Fighter Wing 26 Commander Joseph Pips Priller and his wingman Sergeant Heinz Woderchick. Just two aircraft, two pilots doing what they could, which was essentially nothing, against 11,000 Allied aircraft darkening the sky. Priller had been arguing for weeks with his superiors about the hopeless state of the German western defenses. On the morning of June 6th, he essentially flew to the beaches to prove his point in the only language he knew. The German Navy was similarly impotent. Only 3 torpedo boats engaged the Allied fleet. Germany's naval forces had been so depleted by years of attrition that they could offer no meaningful resistance to an armada of nearly 7,000 vessels. The Allied bombardment fleet alone included 7 battleships, 23 cruisers, and over 80 destroyers. The USS Nevada, raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor, where Japanese aircraft had sent her to the bottom 2.5 years earlier, pounded German positions with her 14-inch guns. The old British battleships Warspite, Ramillies, and Rodney added their voices to the bombardment. German coastal batteries, the pride and centerpiece of the Atlantic Wall, proved largely ineffective against this armada. Many had been positioned to engage an invasion fleet at sea, at range, in daylight. The Allies came in darkness, close in, and established themselves before many batteries could respond effectively. Those that did fire were systematically destroyed by naval counter-battery fire. The massive guns that Hitler had boasted about, the symbols of his greatest builder of fortifications claim, were silenced one by one. By nightfall on June 6th, approximately 150,000 Allied soldiers stood on French soil. 10,000 had become casualties, including approximately 4,400 dead. The Atlantic Wall, that 17 million cubic meters of concrete, that 1.2 million tons of steel, that ocean of human suffering poured into its foundations, had been breached along a 50-mile front in a single day. Within 1 week, 500,000 Allied soldiers had landed in France. By the end of June, the number approached 850,000. By mid-July, 1 million. And here is where the Germans discovered the fourth failure they hadn't anticipated, the failure of their most fundamental strategic assumption. The entire fortress doctrine had been built on the belief that any large invasion force would need to capture a major port within days or face logistical collapse. You could not sustain a 1,000,000-man army over open beaches. Everyone knew that. It was simply physically impossible. And so the Atlantic Wall's heaviest fortifications clustered around the ports. And so the ports would buy time, would strangle the Allied force before it could grow too large to push back. The Allies had anticipated this assumption, and they had built something that had never existed before in the history of warfare. They had built 2 artificial harbors, Mulberry A off Omaha Beach for the Americans and Mulberry B off Arromanches for the British. Prefabricated port facilities constructed in sections in Britain, towed across the channel and assembled off the invasion beaches. Concrete caissons the size of apartment buildings were sunk to create breakwaters. Floating roadways connected the anchored platforms to shore. Vehicles could drive directly from ships to the beach. The scale of engineering imagination and industrial capacity required to build these things is almost impossible to overstate. Germany never anticipated them because Germany could not have built them, and they destroyed the central assumption on which the Atlantic Wall's strategic logic rested. When a severe storm on June 19th damaged Mulberry A beyond repair, the Americans simply increased operations through Mulberry B and began landing supplies directly onto the beaches using LSTs. The logistics that were supposed to strangle the Allied beachhead within days never failed. The assumption was wrong. The fortress strategy had failed at its most fundamental level. Cherbourg, designated by Hitler as a fortress to be held to the last man, the last bullet, the last drop of blood, fell on June 26th and 27th after a 4-day siege. The port had been demolished so thoroughly by the retreating Germans that it was unusable for weeks.
After that expensive lesson, Allied commanders simply bypassed the remaining fortress ports, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Rochelle, Dunkirk. They sat there, their garrisons resupplied by submarine, strategically irrelevant, waiting for the war to end and coming to them in May of 1945. The Channel Islands, which had absorbed 1/12 of all the Atlantic Wall's steel and concrete for propaganda purposes, surrendered with their 28,500-man garrison having been completely bypassed by the war. 1/12 of everything, for islands that contributed nothing to Germany's defense. Operation Cobra came on July 25th. Massive carpet bombing west of Saint-Lô shattered the German defensive line. By July 30th, Avranches fell. Patton's Third Army, the very formation the Germans had expected to lead the phantom invasion at Pas-de-Calais, poured through a 5-mile gap in the German line and swept into the German rear at a pace that left commanders stunned. The Falaise Pocket closed on August 21st, trapping the remnants of 2 German armies in a shrinking cauldron of destruction. Between 10 and 15,000 German soldiers were killed within the pocket. Approximately 50,000 were captured. The roads inside were choked with burning vehicles, dead horses, and the bodies of men who had tried to run, while Allied fighter bombers circled overhead, shooting anything that moved. Eisenhower described it as one of the greatest killing grounds of the war. Between 20 and 50,000 survivors crossed the Seine River in anything that would float, most without heavy equipment, a broken army stumbling east, while Paris was liberated on August 25th to scenes of joy that the city had not seen in 4 years. Total German casualties in the Normandy campaign from June 6th to the end of August reached approximately 290,000. 23,000 killed, 67,000 wounded, over 200,000 missing or captured. 27 of 38 German divisions in Normandy were effectively destroyed as fighting formations. Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France on August 15th, landed 94,000 men along the French Riviera with first-day casualties of just 395. The Atlantic Wall on the Mediterranean was even more ineffective than the one in Normandy. Within 2 weeks, those Allied forces had linked up with Patton's army, and all of southern France was free. When Field Marshal Rommel finally returned to his headquarters close to midnight on June 6th, the 24 hours he had predicted were over. He had received the first telephone call informing him of the invasion at approximately 10:15 in the morning, while still at home in Herrlingen. His initial response, recorded by witnesses who were in the room, was simply, "How stupid of me." He drove back to France in his staff car, 800 kilometers of roads increasingly dangerous from Allied air attack. He arrived knowing what the reports were going to tell him before he read them. His staff recorded his reaction upon learning the full situation. "If I was the commander of the Allied forces right now, I could finish off the war in 14 days. When Field Marshal Keitel called von Rundstedt on July 1st, asking in genuine desperation what they should do now, the old Field Marshal's response has echoed down through history. "Make peace, you fools. What else can you do?" Hitler relieved him of command days later. Albert Speer, reflecting from Spandau prison years after the war, was blunt about the wall he had helped build. All this expenditure of effort was sheer waste. The 1.2 million tons of steel consumed by the Atlantic Wall was enough to build more than 20,000 Tiger tanks. The concrete, the labor, the engineering expertise, all of it poured into positions that could not move, could not adapt, and could not respond to battlefield conditions. The wall's only genuine success came at the fortress ports the Allies chose to bypass rather than assault, which meant it succeeded in being irrelevant rather than in being effective. The 3 fatal mistakes were not isolated errors that could be corrected in hindsight with the luxury of knowing the outcome. They were the expression of a system that had rotted at its core, a command structure built on one man's personal authority rather than military logic,
an intelligence apparatus compromised from admiral to agent by men who had concluded that their leader was leading Germany to destruction, and a strategic doctrine fractured by a compromise that served no one's vision. Underlying all three failures was the same root cause: Hitler's absolute refusal to trust anyone with authority he could retain for himself. The man who declared himself the greatest builder of fortifications of all time had built a system of command that made it impossible for the fortifications to matter. Frederick the Great, the Prussian monarch whom Hitler claimed to admire above all other historical figures, once observed that he who defends everything defends nothing. The Atlantic Wall attempted to defend 2,000 miles of coastline against an enemy with total air and naval supremacy and the industrial capacity of North America behind them. Its failure was not fundamentally a matter of inadequate concrete or insufficient guns. More guns would not have released the Panzer reserves in time. More mines would not have fooled German intelligence into seeing through Operation Fortitude. More bunkers would not have resolved the doctrinal dispute between Rommel and von Rundstedt. The wall failed because the system that built it and defended it was broken in ways that concrete could not fix. Today, the ruins of the Atlantic Wall stretch along the coasts of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway. Concrete bunkers, too massive and too expensive to remove, stand as monuments to the war. Some have been preserved as museums. The battery at Lons-sur-Mer, its 150mm naval guns still sitting in their casements exactly where they were on June 6th, receives thousands of visitors each year. The craters at Pointe-du-Hoc, where American Rangers scaled 100-foot cliffs under fire, remain scarred by the naval bombardment of that morning, as though the guns stopped firing yesterday. In Denmark, bunkers have slowly sunk into the sand dunes, emerging at odd angles like the bones of some ancient buried thing. Along the Dutch coast, graffiti artists have claimed the gray concrete. In Norway, some bunkers have been converted into homes, their meter-thick walls providing insulation against the Arctic cold that their builders never imagined anyone would find peaceful. The forced laborers who built these fortifications left almost no memorials. The French civilians, the Soviet prisoners, the Spanish exiles, the Jewish workers, most of their names are lost entirely. They died in construction accidents, from disease, from malnutrition, from the casual violence of their overseers. They built a wall to defend people who had enslaved them, and the wall failed anyway. Their only monument is the failure of what they were forced to create. June 6, 1944, was not the longest day for Germany alone. It was the day that proved beyond any remaining doubt that the Third Reich could not win the war it had started, not because the Allies were invincible, not because German soldiers fought without courage or skill, but because the system Hitler built, the system of personal authority and institutional paranoia and strategic compromise and willful blindness, had made victory impossible before the first Allied soldier ever touched the sand. The impregnable fortress crumbled in 24 hours, and the tide of history, held back so briefly by concrete and steel, resumed its inexorable flow toward Berlin. If this video hit you the way the history hit me when I dug into it, drop a comment below and tell me which of those three mistakes you think was the most catastrophic: the sleeping Führer, the ghost army, or the argument about the tanks. I genuinely love to know what you think. And if you want more stories like this, stories where the real history is stranger and more devastating than anything Hollywood could invent, hit subscribe right now because there are dozens more coming. Share this with someone who thinks they know D-Day, because I promise you they don't know it this way.